are watching on the live stream, I'd like to welcome you to wherever you may be located, whether at home or you're somewhere else, and hopefully you're not driving right now. I also want to draw your attention to if you're either here in the audience or you're watching through the live stream and you want to ask a question, you could go ahead and just email it to the center's email address, which is ccss@uccs.edu. Of course, for folks in the room, we have speakers at either end of the room, and so if you want microphones at either end of the room, so if you want to use one of the microphones, you can just walk over when we have time for questions and answers. But for people who aren't here, they can go ahead and use that email address to email in questions. And again, it's ccss@uccs.edu. So tonight's talk is part of the Ethics in Sport speaker series that explores ethical issues and their implications in the world of sport. The series of talks is organized by the Center for the Critical Study of Sport and is sponsored by the Daniels Fund Ethic Initiative at UCCS. The mission of the Center for the Critical Study of Sport is to cultivate an intellectual environment that supports high-quality teaching and learning and stimulates research focused on the critical study of sport while sustaining the reputation of UCCS as a center of excellence in this field. Ultimately, we aspire to make sport more democratic, more accessible, and more humane. Before I get to introducing our speaker, I want to mention the next talk that we have, which will be April 13th, and the speaker is Cheryl Cookie. She's the past president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport. She's one of the leading feminist sports scholars in the world right now. She researches media and gender. She's deeply committed to public sociology, and in that vein, she has a widely watched TED Talk, and she has spoken about issues regarding gender inequality in sport numerous times with media outlets, including the PBS NewsHour. So she's an associate professor of American Studies at Purdue University. So she'll be giving her talk, Gender and Ethical Challenge in Sport Media. Again, that'll be April 13th. So please go ahead and register for that. And let's see. Okay, so our talk tonight, we're very honored to welcome John Hoberman, and he'll be delivering his talk, The End of Sport, Why the Doping Epidemic Must Be Brought Under Control. John Hoberman has been active in the field of sports studies for 40 years, and he is one of the world's leading authorities on doping and human enhancements. On this subject, his books include Mortal Engines, The Science and Performance and the Science of Performance and the Dehumanization of Sport, Testosterone Dreams, The Rejuvenation, Aphrodisia, Doping, and coming out this year is Dopers in Uniform, The Hidden World of Police on Steroids. His shorter publications include The History of Synthetic Testosterone and to Steroids. He is also the author of the widely read and discussed book, Darwin's Athletes, How Sport Has Damaged Black America and Preserved the Myth of Race. His areas of research are far-reaching, and you might be surprised to know that he is actually a professor of Germanic languages at the University of Texas, so he is a very broad scholar with vast interests of a world-class caliber. So I am honored tonight to present Dr. John Hoberman. There's yours.
Okay. And so the mic is on. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Professor Montes de Oca. I want to also thank everybody who came out tonight for the talk and those who are looking at this program online. Doping is a big topic. The doping epidemic in global sport goes back about to the 1950s, if you count the amphetamines in European professional cycling. The 1960s, if you talk about the beginning of the anabolic steroid epidemic that has spread around the world in a variety of sports. But before I get into the topic, I want to take a minute in order to say a little bit about the origins of my interest in this topic and the foundation on which the presentation today is built. I became interested in this topic, I think, in the early 1980s, reading high-quality German sports journalism stories about doping. It was surprising and often grotesque. English language coverage of doping has always followed far behind what was available in West Germany, and reading the Spiegel articles and the Munich newspaper articles on doping in West Germany and East Germany just got me, and it has become an interest that is going to last for the rest of my life. One reason for that is that the doping epidemic in high-performance sport, in a certain sense, is a stalking horse for the variety of enhancements that people are interested in and that don't have to have anything necessarily to do with sports. There is you could call it an epidemic of amphetamine-like drug use on campuses, such as Ritalin and Adderall. I don't know what you want to call Botox. It certainly is considered an enhancement. It has moved from the fringe to being socially acceptable. One could say the same thing about a variety of psychoactive drugs. The 21st century is going to be a century of enhancements. There's a lot of talk about what might be done in terms of genetic manipulation. So there are open questions about what human beings are going to do to themselves and allow themselves to do to themselves. And in order to follow this development, one thing one can do is to look at developments in high-performance sport. Mortal Engines came out in 1992. Testosterone Dreams is on the social and medical history of synthetic testosterone drugs. Most of it is about human sexuality and the medical uses of testosterone, only a fraction of the book. It's about sport, and so you can move out from sport into a broader view of how these drugs are thought about and what people want to do with them. The forthcoming book is Dopers in Uniform, The Hidden World of Police on Steroids. This is just more evidence that when you say doping, when in this case you talk about anabolic steroids, one could also mention firefighters, Blackwater people in Iraq. There's all sorts of niche markets for anabolic steroids for so-called action-oriented men. This would include a certain number of soldiers as well. So that when you address the issue of doping in sport, you have, in effect, a portal into the much wider use and reach of these drugs that we need to understand and relate to our own sense of what is right and wrong. This is a clip from a London news conference a few years ago. I was briefly part of an anti-doping group in cycling, Change Cycling Now. What you find in that article is some of the material you're going to be hearing about shortly, and that is the people who run global sport. We're going to be talking a fair amount about the organizations that purport to offer us global sports governance and what their weaknesses are and who are the dramatis personae and what do they really think about doping and in many cases their own bureaucratic self-interest. So we will be covering that topic. And here is the moment to broach that point. You know, when you think about doping, you tend to think about drugs, quite literally. You think about the apparatus with which an elite athlete or the elite athlete's physician might be administering the drug. The syringe is a very common image of doping. you can think about the purported race between the dopers and the drug detectors. And so there is a drug detection machine, and there are the familiar syringes on the screen. What I want to argue is that the limiting of the discussion of doping to individual elite athletes and their guilt, the expression in German is Dopingsinner, is, like all cliches, has an element of truth, but is also very misleading. Doping by elite athletes occurs inside an enormous system that is not controlled by athletes. And so a big dimension of the doping apparatus around the world, which is very much undercovered, is the whole world of the International Olympic Committee, the international federations, the World Anti-Doping Agency, this enormous apparatus that is purportedly engaged in what you might call the global regulation of doping drugs. So what we want to do today is to take a big look at that and see what more is involved than the individual athlete who and may or may not shame, may or may not serve a man before he or she is allowed to resume his or her career, assuming that that person is able to do that. So is it the syringe, is it that doping sinner, the individual athlete, or is it, there is the IOC Executive Committee, and here we have Vladimir Putin with the most recent ex-president of the International Olympic Committee, Jacques Rogge. These people constitute an offshore world about which little is reported that ought to be in terms of their ethics, not just the athletes' ethics, but the people who run the system within which the athletes operate. When you go back to the 1980s, it was a great era for the use and abuse of anabolic steroids by elite athletes. You may or may not remember or be aware of Jarmila Kratochvilova, whose record in the 800-meter run has not been approached for the past 35 years. This is what she looked like in her heyday. She was not pulled off the track as somebody who clearly was abusing anabolic steroids. Here is Marie de Koch, 400 meters in 47.6 seconds. This is not a time that has really been approached since 1985 either. Her bodily presentation is, of course, more normal. One then goes to the great book, Doping Documents, produced by a woman who was a non-steroid using a female shot putter in the late 1960s, who was throwing against doped East German women and losing by a lot. And on page 150 or 151, you can look up the doping regimen of Marie de Koch. And what one finds is that between 81 and 84, she ingested something over 1,000 milligrams of the special East German steroid oral Turinabol. If you go to the website of the International Federation, the IAAF, she's still there. There is an article, the last time I looked, about Marie de Koch and Heike Drexler, who was an East German, also a sprinter, who was also a doper. And the IAAF, the International Federation that is supposed to be taking care of this stuff, has almost nothing to say about the fact that these were dope people. That the priority is public relations and keeping the heroes of the past alive rather than going after those doped records and pulling them out of the record books and saying, this is not normal for human beings. If Kratochvilova ran a 153 in 1983 and nobody's come within meters and meters of that time, this is clearly not a human performance. But for whatever reason, the International Federation will not make this reckoning with the doping past and say, this was a fraud. We are interested in normal human performances. This is what we can reasonably expect a trained human being to do. One of the really grotesque stories that I was reading out back in the 80s was the horrible death of Birgit Dressel, who was a West German heptathlete who died in agony because she was pumped full of about 40 drugs. She was an ambitious young woman. She had an ambitious coach. Her doping doctor was Armin Klümper, a notorious amoral elite athlete doctor who would put anabolic steroids into people. He helped to kill her, and of course he disclaimed all responsibility, which leads us to another topic, and that is the involvement of physicians in the doping project. There has been a large number of people with MDs who have aided and abetted and promoted the doping of elite athletes. I've published a couple of articles on these people. There would seem to be a contradiction between the oath the doctor takes to do no harm, pumping steroids into people, especially women, but for these people, that contradiction really doesn't matter. They want the proximity to the elite athletes. They want the reflected glory. They are, in this sense, ethically failed doctors and remain a lot of them. Here is another young woman who died about a year ago. This is 17. I don't know whether my pronunciation is correct, but Ring Wenyi was a 17-year-old female swimmer at a Chinese training camp. She screams in the middle of the night in her dormitory. Her dormitory mates hear her, and she is dead. There is no autopsy done. There is no autopsy permitted. The parents of this only child are reported by the Chinese media to have stated they did not want autopsy performed. I don't believe that is the truth, but that is what happened. And here, the headline in the Daily Mail is, "Young swimmer who died in the middle of the night sparks new fears that China may have copied Russia's doping regime." And so here we are introduced to the really sort of global international scope of all this, and then the whole question of what sorts of political regimes conduct programs like this will come up shortly. Here is the young woman. When she was happy, she was a very talented swimmer, and we do not know what happened to her, why she died. Okay, is the global regulation of doping drugs possible? This question is interesting to me, not just because I've been looking at the doping phenomenon since 1985, it's because I teach a lot of courses on globalization. And one of the mandatory topics in a globalization course is regulation. What do you do when there are misbehaviors around the world which fall within the purview of your interest, your professional responsibility? What can you do to regulate human misbehaviors literally around the globe? In a nutshell, there is nothing more difficult, and yet it is mandatory that we try to accomplish what can be done in terms of global regulation. Now, and by the way, when it comes to the World Anti-Doping Agency, which as of January 1st, 2000, which charged the responsibility of somehow trying to do global doping control, the World Anti-Doping Agency subsists on an annual budget amounting to less than what Maria Sharapova makes in a year. They're up around $28 million. Hasn't changed much since they went into operation at the beginning of 2000. Now, is the fact that the World Anti-Doping Agency operates on a starvation budget, is this an act of nature or God? No, it is the result of decisions made by human beings in positions of responsibility. We should ask the International Olympic Committee, for example, why it was that they spend so little in partnership with a certain number of governments around the world, such as the United States, why they keep WADA on such a short financial leash. This is when a tennis player is operating with more income than the World Anti-Doping Agency, there is something wrong with that picture. Now, one of my favorite examples of talking about global regulation and human beings' responsibility for enacting and trying to enforce certain kinds of regulations is the whole issue of saving the whales. And here in a minute is my point about the slide you see on the screen. There are 3 levels of rigor with which anti-whaling activity is conducted as a form of global regulation. At the top, you see the International Whaling Federation, founded in 1946, 100 and some members. They pass rules. They do not go out on the high seas in order to intercept ships, typically, for example, from Japan, that are killing whales in the Southern Ocean off of Antarctica. In the second row, what you see is Greenpeace. Greenpeace includes anti-whaling activism in their varied activities around the world, but they will hold up banners, but they are, by principle, nonviolent. And so that if they see a Japanese whaling ship killing whales off of Antarctica, there's really not a whole lot they can do about it except to make their presence and their protests known. The third option is what you might call the global vigilantes. This is the Sea Shepherd Society, founded by Paul Watson back in, I think it was 1974. He broke off from Greenpeace because he would not tolerate the nonviolence of Greenpeace. And so what the Sea Shepherd ships do is they ram the Japanese whaling ships and physically try to prevent them from killing whales. My point is that global regulation can be carried out at different levels of ambition and rigor. And if you're running a World Anti-Doping Agency on a shoestring, that tells you something about the real concern at the top of global sports organizations about doing something about the doping epidemic. Generally speaking, it is the dictatorships that do state-sponsored doping. The Soviet Union did. East Germany was the champion in this department. Russia, as we know, has been doing it, and I assume that China is doing it as well, and that the death of the young woman was part of a state program. Democracies do entrepreneurial doping, so that you have cells of people who will form around a coach or a doctor, and so you're doing it on a small scale, you're trying to keep it secret, but you don't have the US government going in there and facilitating doping. The Amateur Sports Act of 1978 got the US government out of the elite sports business officially. They give a little bit of money, Congress does, to the United States Anti-Doping Agency. But generally speaking, our government is not mixed up in this unless, of course, the Congress is holding a hearing and dragging in baseball players or other representatives of elite sport in order that they explain how come there's so much doping going on in their sports. Oh, and the news story these days is Alberto Salazar, once the great marathoner of the early 1980s, who has the Nike Oregon Project and who has Mo Farah, the great British distance runner, double gold medalist, et cetera, et cetera. The Nike Oregon Project has an ambition, and that ambition is you are going to have more American Alberto Salazars. Let me tell you a little story about Alberto Salazar. I have seen him in person once. It was a doping seminar at Duke University in 1999. He gave a talk. This was officially an anti-doping activity. And what he said was really depressing in a way, because it was absolutely clear that the ruling thought in Alberto Salazar's head, the coach manager of the Nike Oregon project that is now in hot water, has the FBI on its tail, etc. The only thing that really was boosting human athletic performance. The whole ethical dimension of doping, as far as I could tell, meant nothing to him. And he even told us from the microphone that what he did in the morning was to make sure that his athletic, robust sons were taking as much supplements as they could stand in order to boost their athletic. So you have a choice of options. If you go with the Olympic motto of Sidious Altius, Fortius, faster, higher, stronger, and you want to pursue that in a linear manner into the future, what you get is global doping. That's the norm. It isn't human norms, it isn't humane norms, it isn't the Victorian ethical doctrine that, believe it or not, is still quite powerful in our sporting lives, that emphasizes fair play and, self-restraint. Self-restraint is not a value of our culture these days. It is a go-for-it kind of civilization we are in. If you want an anti-doping sports culture, it has got to include self-restraint as a value. It's out the window. It was obvious that it meant nothing to Alberto Salazar 20 years ago, and I will suggest that that is one of the reasons that he is in trouble now. And so here's one of his former team members accusing him of breaking drug rules. Not a big surprise to me. Now the sponsoring Nike Corporation, this mammoth, powerful sports company accused of hindering the United States Anti-Doping Agency's Salazar doping investigation. So you've got big players here. This is a power contest. And there's all sorts of people and organizations involved. This was not widely reported. As of February 2016, two former high anti-doping officials in Russia wound up dead. Poor Mr. Kamayev, pictured on the top, apparently went out for some cross-country skiing and suffered a, quote, massive heart attack. 2 weeks later, Mr. Sinev died for reasons I have never seen explained online. So here's Mr. Kamayev. Two senior ex-officials of Russia's anti-doping agency died within 2 weeks. Interestingly, this did not become a media favorite as a story. I find that very curious. I mean, this has a lot of tabloid potential, but of course, media pick and choose about what is a big deal and what is not. Doping whistleblowers flee for their lives from dictatorships. There is young Mr. Stepanov. There is the wife, the 800-meter runner, Yulia Stepanova, and their little boy at an undisclosed location in North America. There's Grigory Rodchenko, who blew the whistle. They're whistleblowers. They're Russian anti-doping whistleblowers. Grigory Rodchenko was running the anti-doping agency and blew the whistle to WADA and is also on the run for his life. We know that Vladimir Putin has people assassinated. It is no accident that these people are presumably hiding somewhere in North America. I didn't hear the IOC or the World Anti-Doping Agency make a peep about this scandal and say to Putin, this is not the way world sport is supposed to operate. But we will get to that. Who will protect the anti-doping whistleblowers? There is the WADA general director, Oliver Nigley, has finally, recently came out and says, well, gosh, maybe the anti-doping community has a responsibility to protect the lives of the people who supply this absolutely essential information. There is a new organization called Fair Sport that is raising millions in order to protect their lives of anti-doping whistleblowers. And now you are wondering, why in the world is this speaker talking about crime and criminality and people who are in fear of their lives because they did the right thing? The answer is that when you look at doping in the realistic manner I'm trying to present to you, you stray far from that one individual athlete who did the wrong thing. And who was that person? Was that a person from a comfortable suburb who just doesn't have any ethics? Could it possibly be a distance runner from a dirt-poor society who knows that if he or she can win a big race in Europe during the summer, he or she could set up a poverty-stricken family for life? Is it an accident so many of the dopers who were caught during the Athens 2004 games came from an arc along Eastern Europe, down, Latvia, down to Greece, which, following the Soviet collapse, became even poorer than it already was, Belarus, Moldova, etc. Is it an accident that these women went abroad to try to win every dollar they could running road races from the Atlantic to the Pacific and elsewhere? No. These are people in straitened circumstances whose motives for doping are going to be somewhat different from people who lead more privileged lives. All right, that's me in 2005, trying to look clever. This was an interview in Germany, and the reason I put up that photo with a big smile is that it occurred to me to be able to say to you, in 2005, one could joke about this stuff. In 2005, the Putinization of the global doping had not yet occurred. Those days are gone. And so these days, I am much more inclined to talk about Putin and the gangsterizing of global doping control for the reasons that I've outlined in the last 5 minutes or so. Here is a Daily Mail story, the fact that Putin, quote, was at the heart of the Russia drug scandal, alleges doper-in-chief, who claims he doped half of his country's 72 London 2012 medalists. I would strongly suspect that Putin had a hand in this, just as he has a hand in just about everything that moves in Russian politics and policy, because he is an extreme nationalist. He is an extreme sportive nationalist. And sportive nationalism, this notion that any self-respecting nation has got to produce international caliber medal winners or it will lose its standing, its self-respect as a nation. This is a pernicious doctrine. It is nonsense. You can be a strong country without having medal winners, but it is a way to encourage powerful politicians to insist that their sports establishments crank out medal winners, and those medal winners are often going to require doping in order to be that successful. Putin's propaganda outlet, RT, which you can get in the United States, Russian anti-doping system failed. We should listen to WADA, says Vladimir Putin. Well, forgive me if I attribute a lack of sincerity to Mr. Putin on this occasion. I mean, it's been very interesting to watch the Russians being pinned to the floor by all the evidence of state-sponsored doping and trying to wriggle out of it and trying to kiss and make up with the IOC and WADA, and watching the IOC and WADA collaborate in what this very gradual public relations-based rehabilitation of the Russians so that they can regain their stature within the Olympic family, so-called, and we will get to that topic as well. It's the international federations who have the responsibility of carrying out unannounced testing around the world in their sports. And so then the question becomes, who are these people? And are they reliable? And so here we see Lamine Diack, who was running the International Track and Field Federation between 1999 and 2015. As some of you undoubtedly know, he has been under investigation for financial crimes and skullduggery for quite some time. In the middle there is Sebastian Coe, the new IAAF president, giving Mr. Diack a hug. Perhaps this was in the wake of the vote that put Mr. Coe in charge of the IAAF. And at the bottom, one sees Mr. Coe. I remember watching Sebastian Coe run a great mile in Oslo. It was midnight, late July 1985. It was thrilling, absolutely thrilling. You could watch a race. I used to go, this was in Oslo, I used to go to Oslo in the 70s and the 80s and watch the great golden, whatever they were called, track meets, great miles. This night it was Steve Cram who ran the 3:46:32, I remember, right around midnight, and Sebastian Coe was chasing him to the line. And all the great milers were there. And you could watch, it's 1985. 1985 is the year I first walked into the library at the University of Texas and tried to learn everything I could about anabolic steroids. But in July of 1985, I could watch a world-class race and not be haunted by the doping at the back of my head. So Coe was there. He was a great runner. He has never been credibly accused of doping. The question is, what sort of an international sports executive is he? Is he going to have the courage and the determination to blow the whistle when that is what is required? For the last couple of years, he's been in trouble. Parliament doesn't like what they hear from him. He is being accused of a lack of candor. Is he just another self-serving person who wants to ascend to the top? I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he has his eye on the presidency of the IOC, as a number of these people do. Now here is Hein Verbruggen, now once a member of the IOC, now an honorary member of the IOC. The point of referring to Hein Verbruggen here, one of the great egomaniacs in global sport, and that is saying something, is that he was in charge of the International Cycling Union, the UCI, between 1999 and 2005, which just coincidentally coincides with Lance Armstrong's Tour de France victories, the 7 consecutive victories. My point about Hein Verbruggen is not really about Lance Armstrong. It says when you read what Hein Verbruggen actually said, he had contempt for doping control. He had contempt for athletes who confessed to doping. He had contempt for anybody who was going to spoil the show by blowing the whistle on what turned out to be comprehensive doping practices within professional cycling. And he made it to the top of one of the most important international sports federations in the world. Do you see where I'm going with this? That there is an entire population of unreliable people who recruit themselves into the International Olympic Committee, into the international federations, and are then taken seriously by 99% of the world's sports journalists as engaged in the anti-doping struggle. Here's FINA, the swimming federation. There is Cornel Marculescu, Romanian, who's really been running the swimming federation since 1980, my God, 30 years or so. He doesn't think doping is much of a problem. In swimming, namely, which has been racked by doping scandals for the last 25 years. When you see one of the most powerful people in international sports saying, it's not a problem with us, you know he's dishonest. You know that he is there because he likes the power, he likes the perks, he likes the hotels, he likes the first-class travel, he likes getting his name in the paper, he likes meeting all the politicians, straight and crooked. That's why a lot of these people are there. And so then the question becomes, can we rely on these people to pursue an anti-doping program? Nor are they willing to look into and perhaps annul the records of the famous East German female swimmers who won 13 of 15 gold medals in Montreal in 1976, And they stood up there, and the world press gasped and said, oh my God, they look like linebackers, and how come their voices are so deep, and why is that hair growing in the wrong places, et cetera, et cetera. All the evidence of steroid abuse was there. Organized sport did not really do anything about it, and they continued to compete for another decade and more. Swimming needs athletics, track and field style, drugs investigation says, Coach, it is not going to happen unless FINA collapses in the manner of the FIFA collapse over the past couple of years. I mean, there was the collapse of FIFA in scandal and 40 people arrested and all these guys in their expensive suits being let out of the expensive Swiss hotel in handcuffs and all the rest of it. That was a little glimpse into the real world of the power games at the top of the international sports federations. They are symbolic of a lot of other people. What about drug testing at the Olympic Games? What has been the results of testing over the past half century or so? If you look at the games from 1968 to 1996, that's Mexico City to Atlanta, you have 8 Olympiads, Summer Olympiads. Let's say that there's maybe 6,000 people at each, so you got about 50,000 people. Of those 50,000 people, over 28 years, 52 tested positive. That's 1 in 1,000. And the number of steroid positives in that 52 was a fraction of the 52. In the case of, in Sydney, the World Anti-Doping Agency begins to supervise drug testing at the Olympic Games. It was not a great success. They didn't catch anybody on EPO, for example. The listed positives at that, and you're looking at 10,000 athletes, was 15. Athens, another 10,000 athletes, 37. Beijing, 32. London, 51. And Rio, I was surprised to see, was only 6, although that may be because they washed out a lot of people in advance who had been found to be doping. See, time-wise, we're... Oh my goodness, okay. I think at this point I should hasten through some of the remaining slides, which is about the political history of the IOC. Here you see an IOC president with Hitler. Here you see another IOC president with Hitler. Here you see another IOC member who, had he not died on the Russian front in 1942, might have been the first IOC member to be hanged at Nuremberg for war crimes. He was a member of the IOC for 5 years. The Nazis did not care a whit about whether or not you were a Nazi member of the IOC. Didn't matter. And my point is, if those are your ethical standards, can this organization be relied upon to adopt a code of values that prioritizes anti-doping? Well, there's a lot of photographs of Mr. Samaranch with a variety of unwholesome people, and here I think we're at the end here. The IOC, and this goes back to my point about the ethical standards that pervade. I mean, if you ever met IOC members, if you ever want to encounter a sense of entitlement, that's where to find it. The IOC has collaborated with every dictatorship it has encountered in the process of conducting Olympic business. There's dictatorships who do state-sponsored doping. The IOC has never had any moral or ethical principles, and it never will. Don't expect the doping crisis to do what the Nazi catastrophe could not. And then finally, here is a recent headline about ready for the gene dope freak show. That's the inevitable future of pro sports. Well, it will be if there are no ethical standards discussed and enforced in order to prevent the quote-unquote freak show from happening. To some extent, it already has. When you look back over decades of steroid-bloated human beings who competed as runners or weightlifters or swimmers or whatever, the steroid freak show began decades ago. Interestingly, the calls for the legalization of doping that you hear over and over and over again have not been embraced by any of the powerful and often compromised people I've been describing to you. And I think the reason is that doping human beings so contradicts the Victorian sporting heritage that we absorb as children, the level playing field and fairness, and never forget the value of self-restraint. That is still powerful enough to dissuade even amoral people at the top from saying, okay, let's stop this anti-doping nonsense and go for it and take the CRISPR gene editing technique and really produce athletes who can go faster and higher and are stronger. There is, interestingly, there is a certain cultural conservative restraint that is operating at the top of every powerful sports organization in the world that does not allow it to embrace doping as the solution to the doping problem around the world. And so with that observation, and later than I should, I will say thank you for your attention and open the floor to questions and comments.
If you don't mind. Go to, where is it? Oh, back here. There we go. Okay, so thank you very much, John, for giving such a great talk. For those people who are watching through the live stream, please feel free to email questions into ccs@uccs.edu. I know, it's on the screen over here. And we can go ahead and take questions to Dr. Hoberman. Well, I'll ask a question. Oh, do you have a question here?
The gentleman in the green shirt had a question.
Oh, go for it.
So when they're doing that, the test of Olympics, are those numbers slide, like, because they can go back and still drug tests for different substances that people have used, that they only found at 6 at Rio. Do you think that number is going to keep increasing as they find more doping?
If they continue the radioactive samples that are stored in cold conditions for 8 or 10 years. I mean, they're finding, I think it was a few dozen people from the London 2012 games who were caught through retroactive testing because the technology gets better. My point is that it is tempting but mistaken the dopers ahead of the detector. Okay, this is the, the cat and mouse metaphor that is always used to describe this sort of unwholesome foot race between the cheaters and the people in the labs who have the mass spectrometers and for electrophoresis and all that in order to try to find these molecules in human athletes. That's just the technical side. What I have tried to emphasize is not the biochemistry, but the human chemistry. And that I will claim that 95% of the doping phenomenon has to do with human relationships, the choices that people make with, inside or outside of a system of values, which is clearly what is missing. You can't have values without, as a person, being willing to exercise self-restraint. That is just the way we human beings are built. That's why every religion worth its salt is going to emphasize this capacity along with others. So what I'm asking you to do is to take the big view. And that is a perfectly fine question. We need good numbers. As a matter of fact, the numbers I gave you are off of Wikipedia. The original 52 over 28 years came from the Washington Post, Amy Shipman in 1999. I went to Wikipedia and I checked it against it. They came up with 51. So I figured, it's about 50 people over a 28-year period. You're looking at every 1,000th athlete testing positive for something, and it might have been junk. It might have been an agent that was not nearly as effective as an antibiotic steroid if it is used properly in conjunction with resistance training. So I'm really pushing the big picture. But thank you for your question. Yes, please.
The past athletes that have been part of this doping regime, their age, they've moved on, and from what I understand, many of them have had really severe side effects from all of this chemistry in their systems at a fairly young age when they're still developing and moving along. I find it curious that this group of athletes is so silent.
Well, in a way, I know who you're talking about primarily, and that would be the East German women who have suffered hundreds of medical injuries, including the children with the club feet and the infertility and all sorts of gynecological maladies. I know a German doping historian who's published at least, I think, 2 books. He's the expert on what happened to these people. Years ago, the unified German Olympic Committee, which is to say, after, the East Germany collapses at the end of 1989, and then in 1990, 1991, the West Germans are in the process of absorbing all the East German talent they could get their hands on, including doping doctors, by the way. Some of the athletes, their jaws drop. They say, how in God's name can you do that? But that is the way ambitious sports officials often behave. So that there is indeed a subpopulation of medically damaged people. The best known are the hundreds of women who were in the state-sponsored program in East Germany. But the other half of my brain was thinking of another subpopulation of women. And that is people you can still read about today. And that is the people who did not get to stand on the victory podium or the second or third place podium because they were beat out by dopers. And the people, in the case of the East German women who have had lifelong, in many cases, medical problems. Years ago, the unified German Olympic Committee offered all of them the equivalent of $5,000 or $10,000 and said, take this, disappear, which was insulting. It demonstrated an absence of willingness to really engage with a terrible past. So there's one set of victims. But the people who didn't make it to the podium, the people there is a film, as a matter of fact. I forget her name, but one of the once famous American female swimmers who swam at Montreal, lost to doped East German women, and this was 40 years ago. She's still suffering this loss. And now with the improved retroactive testing of samples that were, frozen or chilled 4 or 8 years ago, you have people picking up, clean athletes picking up the phone and hearing, oh, guess what? You're now an Olympic medal winner. And of course, the process that delivered this happy news is a flawed one. That is not the way people want to win medals as clean athletes. That, oh, they caught this Russian woman. And so now you move up from 4th to 3rd, or from 3rd to 2nd, et cetera. It is the complexity of all of this and the degree to which it is really out of control cannot be exaggerated. And so when I look at the highest ranking anti-doping officials, so-called, in the world, at the World Anti-Doping Agency, for example, which has more or less done its best on too little resources, or the International Olympic Committee, which I do not take seriously as people with any standards whatsoever. Whenever I see that somebody is enlisting the International Olympic Committee in anti-doping campaign, I say, well, there's the kiss of death. Because there is going to be no sincere interest on the part of the people at the top. Who's at the top of the IOC right now? It is a German fellow who's, what, about 63. He won a fencing medal in Montreal in 1976. He was a protege of Juan Antonio Samaranch, the Spanish fascist who ran the IOC from 1980 to 2001. And who was it who said that, no, we are not going to take the WADA evidence and simply block the Russian team from the Rio Games? It was Thomas Bach. And one way to figure out why he might have taken that action, and he was denounced, by the way, from a number of people at that level, that, you know, why won't you take this step? One reason he might not have taken this step was because he, and this may sound familiar, he's in debt like this to Vladimir Putin. Why? Because it was Putin who forced the Russian oligarchs to come up with $50 billion to finance the 2-week Sochi Winter Games in 2014, thereby rescuing the IOC out of a difficult position. And so, according to this theory, in a certain sense, Mr. Bach was simply bought by Putin, and in a very difficult position. Thomas Bach is the IOC president. The way I see it, did what he could for Mr. Putin back in the summer of 2016 when there was so much pressure to exclude the Russians lock, stock, and barrel. So when you think about doping, don't just think of the man or the woman who got caught. Think about the entire global environment, this political organism within which all of this is happening. And if doping is not being combated in a vigilant way, and the point of the whaling slide was to show that there are levels of vigilance and robustness and ambition with which you can pursue a laudable goal in the area of global regulation. It isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. It depends on who has the convictions and the courage and the determination. And what 30 or 40 years of observation has taught me, these are not the people who recruit themselves to the top of international sporting organizations. And that is why, when this is reported at all, you will read in the paper the plaintive cries of clean athletes who say, why have we been abandoned? Because they have been abandoned. They've been abandoned by the apparatchiks in the five-star hotels who hold the strings. And who, had they been serious about anti-doping for the past 30 or so years, would not have kept the World Anti-Doping Agency on a starvation budget. Yes, sir.
Why is, compared to other drugs, why is performance enhancement drugs more stigmatized
Than
other, say, crack?
Well, I would not say that crack is an unstigmatized drug. You know what? I think there's a more useful comparison. You know what you might say? How come performance-enhancing drugs that boost athletes are so stigmatized, whereas Botox is not? You see, because Botox has won its respectability in the world. Okay? It's definitely an enhancement. Apparently it works. We know exactly how it works. It paralyzes little bitty muscles for 6 months or whatever. But I mean, that is a very good question, because we do have to compare call it the ethical status of the classic athletic performance-enhancing drugs like anabolic steroids or erythropoietin, the blood-boosting hormone that, of course, can be made synthetically and pumped into people. It is an interesting question why the Botox gets a pass, Viagra gets a pass, all sorts of psychoactive drugs. Prozac 25 years ago was a controversial drug. By the way, I'll just put in a book plug, not for me. If you want to read a great book on drugs and performance enhancing, read Dr. Peter Kramer's Listening to Prozac, 1993. It is one of the few great books about performance enhancing drugs. It was a classic. He sold 1 trillion copies and became globally famous. That is now an uncontroversial drug. Interesting, I mean, look at the import of your question. How come the athletically applied anabolic steroids continue to be a scandal, as it were, whereas other enhancements are not? That's a really interesting question. And I guess my provisional answer to that question is that we invest something special in sports. As rotten as so much of big-time sports is in a variety of venues, we will not give up this hope that sport can improve us. It is no accident that when our little boys were 6 years old, I took them right down to age group soccer. And it wasn't so that they could play in the MLS. It was because I and many of us have inherited this idea that the right sort of sports and the right sort of sports ambition is just plain good for people. They will learn to be sociable. They will learn to be self-controlled. They'll learn to cooperate. Well, it's almost impossible for 6-year-olds. They'll learn to pass the ball, for God's sakes. Any little kid team that can pass the ball is going to decimate everybody else. I've seen that with my own 2 eyes. We will not relinquish a belief in what sport can do for us in a wholesome way.
Let me ask, instead of the crack or the Botox comparison, how about iron? Because iron is performance enhancing. And many athletes, from training, they become iron depleted, and they take iron supplements. And in fact, they'll start getting injections of iron because they become so iron depleted. First they take the pills and they're like, that helped, but doesn't help enough. And so then they'll take the injections, and the injections work even more.
Yeah.
But still, the training leaves them depleted. And now they've gotten used to taking pills and injections, and then they might move on. But now iron is performance enhancing, and if you take it in overly large quantities, is deadly. Now, we prescribe anabolic steroids for all sorts of things. Children, elders, many people.
Some things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, how do you compare the stigmatization of anabolic steroids to not stigmatizing and not illegalizing iron?
What Professor Montes de Oca has just done is to raise, in a really sharp fashion, one of the classic problems of doping that you can take back to published discussions of almost 100 years ago. You just hit on a classic. There are these binaries, these conceptual binaries you need to work with in order to begin to get some kind of a rational, systematic grip on what the heck doping is and what should and should not be permitted. For example, is it therapy or is it enhancement? And of course, that line can really blur. In the case of Prozac, you have Dr. Kramer writing about patients who are literally transformed. Is that fair? I mean, you take 6 weeks of Prozac and you're a new person, but your roommate is still his or her own schlumpy self? Is it therapy or is it enhancement? Is it a stimulant or is it a nutrient? These are questions that were being asked between the First and Second World Wars in print, because People were wondering about how to solve these problems then, and clearly we are still wrestling with these things now. In the case, and of course, it's just, I'm just raising the athlete back to his or her normal metabolism. So that you say, the high-performance athlete is going to train to the point where he or she is so iron depleted that it is really medically recommended. It is the healthy, I mean, one could argue it is the healthy thing to do to restore the normal level of iron in this person. By the way, you can make the same argument about testosterone. I can think of the West German physician back in the 1980s who was completely defiant and unapologetic in the face of anti-steroid dogma. And he said, look, these people are depleting themselves, and if I give them some extra testosterone after hard training, I'm simply restoring the normal self. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And just as one of these offshoots out of the sports world and into the real world, there are probably 5, 6, maybe 7 legal prescriptions for supplementary testosterone going to quite legally, American males, probably aging males at this point. Are they entitled? Or maybe I should say, are we entitled, even if I'm not on it? What do you do for people? What should you do for people? What are the risks and the benefits? I mean, the last thing I saw about supplementary testosterone for the non-athletic aging population was, there are medical cautions here that really need to be paid attention to. What is that older male going to acquire as a result of testosterone supplementation, and what might he be doing in terms of medical risk? The heart might be a problem, for example, according to the data. So there is a whole class of problems about what can you or should you do for people, for which reasons. Our culture tends to insist that medical need is a priority. And that which reminds me, masters athletes officially are people over 40 who engage in competitive sports in Asia. Your 40s and your 50s and your 60s and your 70s, the 80s and your 90s, believe it or not. There was a discussion a couple of years ago at the Masters Sports Organization about whether they needed to test an 80-year-old man for doping. Whether fairness required that this 80-year-old be tested to see whether he was trying to seek an advantage over his fellow octogenarians. I mean, this whole thing can, of course, branch off into the absurd, and it has in a number of ways, and I would certainly call that one of them. But what we are willing and ethically permitted to do to human beings in the sense of changing them is no joking matter. And the students, especially in the audience, are going to live to see many things that the rest of us will not. And the 21st century is going to involve a lot of talk and some action about enhancements, and there are going to be protracted discussions of what is right and what is wrong. And those of you who have paid attention to doping, or maybe who have just come to this lecture, are going to say, geez, I remember now. He was talking about this stuff 20 years ago. Because you will see a discussion in the media about whether this or that substance or this or that procedure is right for human beings, which brings you right back to the definition of what a human being is. Is there an essential human being we should preserve as such, with all our problems and horrors? I mean, should we be improved? And if we're going to be improved, then what are the appropriate methodologies for improving us? And who is going to define improvement? I know I could in a heartbeat, but I'm not going to. It's too far off our subject. Yes, sir.
Since everyone in here is entitled to, they assume whatever the side effects are for whatever risk they're willing to take to accomplish a certain goal, why is it sort of shut down for athletes who try to use drugs?
Let me see if I can rephrase that. In other words, I think I heard you say, look, we're all over 21. We're responsible people. Even doctors these days tell us that we're in charge of our own lives, medically speaking. And what I heard you ask was, if you're over 21 and you know what the side effects are, or you think you know what the side effects are, which is not quite the same thing, and you do a cost-benefit analysis regarding the taking of this substance or the use of that particular method, why is it especially stigmatized, it seems, within the sports world? And that's a hard one. I have to come back to my point about that something special about sport that I assume we have inherited from the late 19th century English sports culture that tried to create gentlemen. Now, that is a problematic concept, by the way. But character building, okay? I mean, we can all live with character building, at least for a while, as a desirable goal. That's what makes sports special. I mean, that is why senators who know nothing about doping are going to sit in front of, Mark McGuire and other compromised baseball players in March of 2005 and ask them indignant questions about, why did you do this? It's the baseball players, these so-called role models, which is another problem, who get dragged in front of Congress, whereas other enhancers in the population are not going to attract that sort of attention. I mean, part of it has to do with celebrity. If you're a doping celebrity, then that might bring you to public attention. Although, having said that, let me point something else out. In the area of diversifying what doping is and what kinds of doping have been done. Those of us who remember will recall that I think it was in 2008, the action film star Sylvester Stallone was detained by the Australian Customs Police for having all that human growth hormone in his suitcase. Sylvester Stallone is now over 60 and making action films that make him, he still looks like a bodybuilder. As a matter of fact, there is a section in the new book about steroids and the police where I ask that very question. Most of you it has probably never occurred to you that police officers would use anabolic steroids. That would be my experience. Well, there's thousands of them, probably tens of thousands, actually. How come that never became an issue? Okay? How come all the bulked up Hollywood stars and stuntmen who are required to do action films, that I would assume that any number of them have been on anabolic steroids? You don't gain 30 pounds of muscle in that period of time to get that particular well-paid job in an action film by eating steak every day. But this is not a scandal. There are celebrities or musicians. I mean, there have been, rappers who were talked about of being on anabolic steroids. Even Mary Kay Blige has been, suspected of using anabolic steroids. It doesn't have traction because we don't have the expectations of entertainers that we do of athletes who are put out to us as role models. Movie stars, generally speaking, are not represented to us as moral exemplars. But we have a tradition that insists that athletes, or at least certain kinds of athletes, are moral exemplars or should be moral exemplars. And I think that that helps to account for this disparity that you rightly point to. Yes, please.
In the United States, the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency is trying to tackle the situation of athletes using steroids or safety drugs by targeting youth. You mentioned soccer and the fact that they stress true sport, that's what they call it. They say we value champions and we champion values. They talk about sportsmanship and fairness and also nutrition. So to try to cultivate the young people to actually to be able to withstand the pressure of maybe someone in the system,
Yeah.
the coach or the physician trying to get them to do drugs, kind of like the, just say no
Yeah.
to drugs or
Yeah.
smoking or
Yeah, that one didn't work.
that approach, and could it be done at a global level?
Well, nothing can be done at a global level for a million reasons, including disparate resources available on this continent as opposed to that continent. No, I would say two things about the USADA effort to reach people when they're really young. I think it is the right thing to do, and I think it is an act of desperation at the same time. Because you have to, we all try to teach our kids moral principles and self-restraint and decency, et cetera. And usually that works. Of course, most of us don't have children who are tempted to use doping drugs to get to the Olympics. But the question is whether USADA or anybody, I mean, the World Anti-Doping Agency they have wonderful posters, they have interactive activities on their website, they have inspirational this and inspirational that. And as a matter of fact, a couple years ago, I published an article on, the anti-doping initiatives, are they worth anything? Because what I saw was a lot of flash, was a lot of online activity. I did not see either USADA or the World Anti-Doping Agency say something like, you know what, the reason that we've had a doping epidemic in elite sport since, well, for half a century is because the human body has certain limitations. And certain athletes met those limitations back in the 60s. They did not want to be limited, and so the preferred solution for a lot of people was anabolic steroid use. Somebody has to explain to young people that the so-called Olympic dream is a mirage in the sense that you have no idea what kinds of pressures and ambitions you are going to be subjecting yourself to if you insist that your performance curve keep going up in a linear fashion indefinitely so you can achieve your Olympic dream. In this regard, I will not forget a conversation I had with a woman cycling coach at a major American state university, which will be unnamed. And I guess I was there to talk about doping, and so I met with her in her office, and we chatted about this, and she said with this air of resignation, while my riders are at the university, I pretty much have them under my control. A good coach is going to know whether a kid is doping or not. Okay, I mean, you get to know people in a variety of ways. And at that point, once she came to the point where her coaching and ethical principles were going to lose their grip on these young people, she just kind of rolled her eyes and said, the rest of it is out of my hands. Because she knew, as a serious cycling person, that the most talented were going to encounter pressures and temptations that they would not be able to resist. And by the way, if you want a really readable and credible look inside the world of cycling and the temptations and the grotesqueries and all the rest of it, read Tyler Hamilton's book. The cycling doper, you know, Lance Armstrong teammate, one of many who got caught doping and or confessed to USADA. I forget what Tyler Hamilton's book is called, but it's really worth reading as an inside account of, you know, how could I have lied to my father for all those years? That's what really killed him, when he realized it really got to him. It wasn't cheating cyclists, it was lying to his father. That's one of the problems with doping, is there's a lot of falseness involved. And as Lance Armstrong will be the first to testify, people don't like being lied to. That's what sunk him. He lied. Not that he doped, is that he lied. The British cyclist David Millar, M-I-L-L-A-R, Racing Through the Dark, another memoir, I think from 2013, another book that is well worth reading. He's a more sophisticated person than Tyler Hamilton. Tyler Hamilton had the assistance of a very good sports writer to write his account of his life as a cyclist and eventually as a doper. And it's just very, very instructive. And the one-dimensional doping sinner disappears, and you realize this is a real person, has a real family. He's telling real lies to people who really mean something to him. He's uncomfortable as he watches the blood drip from the bag nailed to the wall into his arm when he's blood doping. It really creeps him out, but he has to do it anyway. And there's a doping doctor there who is supervising it. And in the case of Eufemio Fuentes, was charging these guys $50,000 a person to do it. It's an unwholesome world. And an alternative to this unwholesome world is what USADA would like to turn children into as future athletes. So would many of us. But unless you address the total environment and the sheer pressure to perform, unless these organizations do something about that and say, we will not keep obvious doping records on our website as, you know, inspiration for future track and field athletes. That is not what the people at the top are into. That is not their value system. They're opportunists. And until, well, the IOC is already a bunch of opportunists, so that they are not candidates for instigating reform. USADA, I mean, they're honest people at USADA and WADA. They're in a jam because they're operating in such a dirty world, and they have so little company towards the top when it comes to trying to quote unquote reform. And it's the opportunists who have access to enormous amounts of money, and WADA can't even get its hands on Sharapova's annual income. So that when, quote unquote, the media focus on the individual who has committed the doping violation, what I've tried to stress is that there is an enormous amount of circumstance and environment and other actors in the play who are left out of that picture. And in a way, the saddest people who are left out of the picture, I mean, the saddest cases are the clean athletes who just won't do it. And how often, I mean, I've spent the last 20 or 30 years reading every doping story I could get my hands on. I mean, I get a doping news feed 7 days a week for the last 20 years. let me tell you, one of the rarest stories you will see will be the interviewed clean athlete who just feels betrayed by the system. These people don't get the coverage. It's the big stars who get the coverage. And people wonder why the doping problem is intractable. It's because nothing like the required resources are brought to bear upon it.
It's going to have to be a very quick question.
Yeah.
Okay. No, please.
So, say for example, I don't want to go to a track meet and watch someone that could run an 11.2, like something I could run too. So it's like most people want to see something they can't do, you know. And letting people use anabolic steroids, say it's bad for the health, and it's the same thing. An athlete can just walk on the track, pull a hamstring, and is done for his career. So.
Well, I mean, that is an excellent point about the nature of the demand for performance. That, well, you know, some of us would go to track meets. I mean, if you go to your kid's soccer game, you're not going to be at the World Cup. You know, I mean, the ultimate question for those of us who want to think about these matters, I think, is what is sports for? What is it for? If it's entertainment, then let the freak show blossom. Okay? If it is more than that, then there are going to be restraints imposed on the so-called freak show. I would, I mean, just speaking personally, I ran for 30 years. I wasn't very good, but I loved it. And I have wonderful memories from being a runner at a very mediocre level. But I've seen world records set at great track meets. I think the sports experiences that mean the most to me were watching our little boys play soccer when they were small. I mean, if you are fortunate enough to be a parent, that can be what sport is for. I mean, forgive the sentimentalism, but I'm serious. What is it for? And each of us is in a position to make decisions about what it's for. If you have to see that 100, run in a Usain Bolt fashion, and there, of course, we hope is a clean athlete. We hope is a clean athlete. That would be wonderful. He has never been plausibly accused, thank goodness. But if he, of course, is very, very special. But if you need to see people set records, then it's over. In terms of imposing restraint and imposing the most important form of restraint, which is not my restraining somebody else, but my restraining myself or that other person restraining himself or herself. There is a very dramatic divide between these different options. And most people, of course, want the entertainment with a capital E. They want to see those people colliding on the field in the NFL in a really unhealthy manner. Manifest public concern about the concussions crisis? I don't think so. And the NFL had to be dragged kicking and screaming into taking any sort of responsibility for what is happening to those men on the field, and yet everybody knows the reason it's a $10 billion industry is because of the crushing blows that are administered on that field. You've got people colliding at combined speeds of 30, 35 miles an hour. It's like you ran 35 miles an hour into a brick wall, which is insane. But you see, that's an excellent point. What do people want? And how might what people want conflict with what you or I after some reflection, might consider to be decent standards.
Okay, thank you very much. So please join me. Thank you, Dr. Hoberman. And please sign up to come to Cheryl Cookie's talk on April, when did I say that was? April 13th. April 13th, we'll be over in the UC 116. And as you can see, we get really great speakers addressing very interesting and complicated ethical issues. So please come out for our next talk. And thank Dr. Hoberman one more time for coming here from Texas. And there's more food. So please, take food. It's the ethical thing to do. Don't let food be wasted.